It's April 1861. Picture this. You're a nobody. Just a regular person trying to make ends meet. Maybe you run a small shop selling supplies, own a little factory, or trade goods up and down the river. You're not rich. You're not powerful. You're just there. Then everything changes. A war erupts. The American Civil War. It will become the bloodiest conflict your country has ever witnessed. Over 600,000 lives will be lost. Families will be shattered, cities will be reduced to ash, and the very soul of the nation will be tested. And you? Amidst all this horror, you become filthy, obscenely, unimaginably rich. I'm not talking about a fortune built over a lifetime. No, this happens fast. Some of these men, who started just like you, became millionaires in less than 2 years. Now, $1 million back then? That's like being a billionaire today. While soldiers were dying in muddy, disease-ridden fields, while widows were draped in black, while the country was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, a small, shrewd group of businessmen were making fortunes so vast their family names would dominate American wealth for generations to come. This is the story of the American Civil War profiteers. The men who literally turned blood into gold. But here's where it gets truly wild. These weren't just lucky entrepreneurs who happened to be in the right place at the right time. No. Many of them actively manipulated the chaos for their own gain. They saw the desperation of a nation at war not as a tragedy, but as the business opportunity of a lifetime. Imagine selling rifles to your own army that you knew were defective, that would jam or even explode in a soldier's hands. Imagine hoarding essential supplies like blankets or medicine, creating artificial shortages just to drive up prices and gouge the government that was trying to save the country. This wasn't just happening, it was rampant. Bribes were passed to government officials, contracts were awarded to friends and cronies, and the quality of goods supplied to the troops was often scandalously poor. They sold shoddy uniforms that would dissolve in the rain, inedible food that sickened the troops, and horses and mules that were too old or sick to be of any use. For every dollar they saved by cutting corners, a soldier's life was put at greater risk. Yet the profits rolled in, creating a new class of ultra-wealthy industrialists. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and Philip Armour all had their starts or saw their fortunes explode during this period. When the smoke finally cleared in 1865 and the dead were counted, these men didn't face justice. They walked away as some of the richest and most powerful figures in America. They were the new elite, the robber barons of the Gilded Age, and they had built their empires on the back of a national catastrophe. This is the story of how war forged American capitalism as we know it. It's about how desperate times created desperate fortunes. The term war profiteer carries such a dark, dirty weight for a reason. The events of those 4 chaotic years didn't just make a few men billionaires overnight. They fundamentally rewired the relationship between wealth, power, and government in America. And honestly, we are still living with the consequences of that today. The patterns of cronyism, of prioritizing profit over people during a crisis, didn't end with the Civil War. So stick around because understanding this dark chapter is key to understanding the world we live in right now. How do you become a billionaire during a war? It's a question that's both fascinating and deeply unsettling. While soldiers were dying on the battlefield, a select group of businessmen were making fortunes that would shape America for a century. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the dark, forgotten history of the Civil War profiteers. Let's set the scene because to understand how these fortunes were made, you have to understand just how unprepared America was for war. When the Civil War started in April 1861, the United States Army had about 16,000 soldiers. 16,000. That's smaller than the crowd at a modern baseball game. The Union suddenly needed to equip, feed, clothe, and arm hundreds of thousands of troops essentially overnight. The government had no infrastructure for this. No massive weapons factories, no warehouses full of uniforms, no supply chains for feeding armies. Nothing. The entire military-industrial complex we know today? It didn't exist. They had to build it from scratch immediately while people were actively shooting at each other. And here's the kicker. They had to do it through private contractors. The government literally didn't have the capacity to make its own supplies quickly enough. So they turned to businessmen and said, we need everything. Guns, bullets, uniforms, boots, tents, food, horses, wagons, and we need it yesterday. You can probably already see the problem. When you have desperate buyers with unlimited money, because the government could just print more or take on debt and limited suppliers, who control the only factories and resources, well, that's not capitalism. That's a license to print money. And some men took full advantage. But it gets so much worse than simple price gouging. What happened next will shock you. Let me tell you about a man named J. Pierpont Morgan. Yes, that J.P. Morgan. The same guy who'd later become one of the most powerful bankers in American history. But in 1861, he was just 24 years old and hungry for opportunity. Morgan heard about a peculiar situation. The army had a stockpile of surplus defective carbines. They'd been rejected and sold off as scrap for $3.50 each. Because they were dangerous, they had a nasty habit of blowing off the shooter's thumb. Now, a normal person might think, defective guns that maim soldiers? Probably shouldn't sell those. Morgan thought differently. He bought them, then immediately turned around and sold these same defective weapons back to the government for $22 each. The same weapons, the same defects, just different paperwork. Union soldiers ended up shooting themselves with guns their own government had already rejected once before, and Morgan made a 500% profit. When this came to light, Morgan was actually taken to court. And you know what happened? He won. The court ruled that caveat emptor, buyer beware applied, even when the buyer was the government desperately trying to arm soldiers. And even when the seller knew the weapons were defective. Morgan walked away richer and with no criminal record. But Morgan wasn't alone. Not even close. A man named Simon Stevens convinced the government to buy 5,000 rifles at $22 each. Sounds normal enough, right? Except these rifles were ancient Austrian muskets that had been sitting in a New York warehouse, purchased for $3.50 each just weeks earlier. They were obsolete, inaccurate, and many didn't even work. Soldiers called them European trash. But Stevens became very, very wealthy. The uniform scandal was arguably even worse. Contractors sold the army uniforms made from shoddy, a cheap material made from recycled wool scraps and fabric dust, all held together with glue. The first time these uniforms got wet, they literally fell apart. Soldiers marched into battle wearing uniforms that dissolved in the rain. The term shoddy, which we still use today to mean poor quality, comes directly from this scandal from Civil War profiteers scamming their own soldiers. And food? Don't even get me started. Contractors sold the army rotten meat, weevil-infested flour, and coffee that was mostly sawdust. Thousands of soldiers got sick, many died from the very supplies meant to keep them alive. One investigation found that contractors had sold the government pickled beef that was actually horse meat. Not because the horse was cheaper, but because they could label it as beef and charge a premium. But the really big money? That wasn't in weapons or uniforms, it was in cotton. Before the war, the American South produced about 75% of the world's cotton. British textile mills, European fashion industries, American factories, everyone depended on Southern cotton. Then the war started and suddenly that supply was cut off. The price of cotton absolutely exploded. What had been worth 10 cents a pound before the war shot up to over $1 a pound, a tenfold increase. And that's if you could even get it. Smart traders realized something incredible. If they could get Southern cotton past the Union blockade and into Northern or European markets, they could make unbelievable fortunes. And some men were willing to do anything to get that cotton. This created one of the strangest dynamics in military history. Union and Confederate soldiers were actively killing each other on battlefields, while Union traders were secretly doing business with Confederate cotton dealers behind the lines. Sometimes with the knowledge of military commanders. Sometimes even with their participation. General William Tecumseh Sherman, the guy who burned Atlanta to the ground, absolutely despised these cotton speculators. He once wrote, "I wouldn't trust one of these cotton traders any farther than I could throw him." He believed, probably correctly, that cotton speculation was actually prolonging the war because it gave the Confederacy a way to raise money. But here's where it gets really dark. Some Northern businessmen actively wanted the war to continue because the longer it lasted, the more money they made. They weren't rooting for the Union to win quickly, they were rooting for continued chaos because chaos meant continued profits. Let that sink in. Men were hoping for more American deaths because it was good for their profit margins. Now you might be wondering, where was the government in all of this? Why didn't they stop it? Well, the government was complicated and often complicit. See, many of the government officials responsible for awarding contracts were either incompetent, overwhelmed, or corrupt. Sometimes all three. Secretary of War Simon Cameron was so notoriously corrupt that Lincoln eventually had to fire him. Cameron's approach to contracting was essentially, my friends get the deals. Competence and fair pricing were optional. One investigation found that Cameron had awarded a contract for 75,000 uniforms to a man who didn't own a factory, had never made uniforms, and didn't even have fabric. The man just got the contract because he knew the right people. He then outsourced to the lowest bidder, who produced those infamous, shoddy uniforms that fell apart. But here's the thing, even when fraud was discovered, even when investigators found clear evidence of corruption, prosecutions were rare. Why? Because the government needed these contractors. They couldn't afford to alienate suppliers when they desperately needed supplies. So mostly, they just looked the other way. There were some exceptions. Some officials genuinely tried to stop the corruption, and some investigators worked tirelessly to expose fraud. But they were swimming against a tide of systemic corruption enabled by wartime chaos. This wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a system built on desperation, opportunity, and greed. But it's crucial for understanding how wealth and power were built in America. Ever wondered where some of the biggest fortunes in American history really came from? It wasn't just brilliant inventions or hard work. For many, the secret was war. Specifically, the American Civil War. Before the war, railroads were important, sure, but they were still a relatively small part of the economy. The war changed everything. Suddenly, railroads weren't just useful. They were absolutely essential. The Union's ability to move troops, supplies, weapons, and food was its single greatest advantage and arguably the reason it won. And this sudden, desperate need created a gold rush for a select few. Take Cornelius Vanderbilt. Before the war, he was wealthy, but not a titan. He saw the opportunity. By securing lucrative government contracts to transport soldiers and supplies, he made a killing. He charged premium prices, and with the government desperate, they paid. Vanderbilt then used those massive profits to buy up competing railroads, consolidating his power and building an empire. By the end of the war, he was one of the richest men in America, and he wasn't alone. The government wasn't just paying for services. It was literally giving away fortunes. The Pacific Railroad Acts, passed during the war, granted railroad companies millions of acres of free land and millions of dollars in government bonds to build the first transcontinental railroad. But here's the part that's truly staggering. While these men were becoming fabulously wealthy off government handouts, how much was a Union soldier being paid? The very men fighting and dying to preserve the nation? $13 a month. And some months, they weren't even paid that, because the government claimed it had run out of money. Imagine that. The government is broke when it comes to paying its soldiers, but has millions to hand over to railroad tycoons. It's a contrast that's as infuriating as it is revealing. This wasn't just about a few individuals getting rich. The Civil War created a new blueprint for American capitalism. Before the 1860s, American business was mostly small scale. You had local merchants, small factories, and regional companies. The war created the first truly massive national corporations. It normalized the idea of a close, often cozy, partnership between big business and the government. It demonstrated that the fastest path to immense wealth wasn't always slow, steady innovation, but securing massive government contracts. Think about it. That military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower famously warned the nation about a century later? Its DNA was formed right here in the profiteering system of the Civil War. The war proved that in times of national crisis, there were unimaginable profits to be made. And the wealth created during this era didn't just disappear. The families who got rich from the Civil War often stayed rich for generations. The Morgans, the Vanderbilts. Even the fortunes of future titans like Carnegie and Rockefeller were often built on capital that was first accumulated during the war. So much of what we think of as old money in America has its roots, one way or another, in this period of conflict and questionable contracts. Now you might think this was just a dark chapter from a bygone era. But here's the truly disturbing part. The pattern has never stopped. Every major American war since has been plagued by similar scandals. During World War I, contractors were caught selling the government rotten meat and shoddy supplies, an exact echo of scandals from the Civil War. During World War II, there were congressional hearings over defective aircraft parts and price gouging. In the Vietnam era, the term war profiteer became a household phrase. synonymous with corporate greed feeding off a controversial war, and in our own time, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Private contractors like Halliburton were awarded billions of dollars, often in no-bid contracts, while constant questions about overcharging, waste, and fraud swirled around them. The names and the technologies change, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. War creates urgency. Urgency creates desperation. And desperation creates a golden opportunity for those willing to exploit the system. The profits are simply too enormous for everyone to resist the temptation. This brings us to a really difficult philosophical question. Some people argue that, as distasteful as it is, this kind of profiteering is a necessary evil. They say that to get industries to rapidly scale up production for a war effort, you have to offer the promise of huge profits. That profit motive is what mobilizes a nation's industrial capacity faster than anything else. Without it, companies wouldn't take the financial risks to expand factories and retool production lines. And there's a kernel of truth to that. The industrial North did outproduce the agricultural South, and that advantage was decisive in the Union's victory. So, from a cold, utilitarian perspective, maybe the price of victory was allowing a few men to become obscenely rich. But then you have to weigh that against the moral cost. What about the soldiers who died because their rifles were defective? The ones who froze because their uniforms fell apart in the rain? What about the families who fell into poverty back home because their sons and husbands weren't being paid? Where do you draw the line between a legitimate profit for a vital service and a moral exploitation? Between a necessary incentive and just plain theft from the public treasury? I don't have a perfect answer. It's one of the most complex moral dilemmas of modern history. But I do know this. When a nation is fighting for its very survival, when its citizens are making the ultimate sacrifice on the battlefield, there is something deeply and fundamentally broken about a system that allows others to become billionaires by selling defective goods to their own army. There's something profoundly wrong when the path to fortune is paved with the tragedy of war. This is a side of our history that we don't often talk about, but it's shaped the world we live in today in profound ways. What if I told you that one of the deadliest wars in American history was also one of the greatest wealth creation events ever? We're talking about the American Civil War. It's a conflict we remember for ending slavery and preserving the Union at the cost of over 600,000 American lives. But there's another, darker story here. A story of how a handful of men became richer than anyone had ever been before in American history. And they didn't get there through brilliant innovation or backbreaking hard work. No, these fortunes were built on a foundation of exploitation, corruption, and profiting from a national tragedy. Imagine this. While soldiers were marching into battle, some were wearing uniforms that would literally dissolve in the rain. Others were carrying rifles so defective they were known to blow soldiers' thumbs off. And they were eating meat that was already rotten. These weren't accidents. They were products sold to the Union Army by contractors who put profit above the lives of their countrymen. These fortunes were built while other men died. This isn't just some forgotten chapter of history. Those ill-gotten gains became the bedrock of American industrial capitalism. The families and companies that profited from the Civil War went on to build railroads, found massive banks, and dominate entire industries. Their descendants effectively became America's first aristocracy. This reveals an uncomfortable truth about American wealth. Some of its oldest and largest fortunes have deeply troubling origins. The Civil War showed us something fundamental about how capitalism can operate during a crisis. When the normal rules of society break down, when desperation sets in, and when government oversight disappears, wealth doesn't trickle down. It rockets upward, flowing directly to those who are positioned to capture it, and it flows incredibly fast. We have this romantic image of war as a time of noble, shared sacrifice for the greater good. And for many, it is. Soldiers, nurses, and families on the home front certainly sacrifice. But war has always had this shadow side, a group of people who see conflict not as a tragedy to be endured, but as an opportunity to be exploited. For them, it's not about sacrifice. It's about a profit margin. The phrase, "never let a good crisis go to waste," could have been invented during the Civil War, because that's exactly what these war profiteers did. And it's a pattern that continues to repeat itself in every war, every pandemic, every moment of national emergency. So the real question isn't just, did this happen? We know it did. The question we should be asking is, why do we keep letting it happen? More than 150 years later, we're still grappling with war profiteering. We still hear about defense contractors overcharging the government by millions. We still find defective products being sold to our troops. The details change. Instead of shoddy uniforms, it might be overpriced medical supplies. Instead of faulty rifles, it might be inadequate body armor, but the underlying pattern of profiting from crisis remains the same. Perhaps that's the real lesson here. It's not just that the Civil War made billionaires, but that crisis will always make someone rich. The question is whether we, as a society, are okay with that. Are we okay with some people accumulating obscene wealth while others are making the ultimate sacrifice? Let me leave you with this final thought. One of the men involved in a scandal selling defective rifles back to the army at a huge markup was J.P. Morgan. Today, the company he founded, J.P. Morgan Chase, is one of the largest and most powerful banks in the entire world, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. That's not ancient history. That's a legacy. It's an origin story that is still shaping our world right now. So, what do you think? Is war profiteering an ugly but necessary part of mobilizing a nation for conflict? Or is it one of the most immoral acts a person can commit? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're interested in more deep dives into the uncomfortable truths they do and teach you in school, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious.